Well, welcome everyone who are here, and thanks for being part of the Manoa Department of Political Science Colloquium Series. My name is Nicole Grove. I'm an associate professor here in the department and am convening the colloquia this semester. We're so glad to have Professor Nitasha Sharma with us today to talk about her new book, Hawaiʻi Is My Haven, Race and Indigeneity in the Black Pacific, which just came out this August, I believe, on Duke University Press. Professor Sharma is a comparative race scholar who offers an interdisciplinary, comparative, and ethnographic approach to the study of difference, inequality, and racism. The central goal of her teaching, research, and writing is to contest interminority racisms by ethnographically detailing existing models of cross-racial solidarities among non-white groups. By highlighting historical crossovers, comparative or relational racialization, and expansive political orientations, Sharma's work attempts to imagine liberated futures for all people. Professor Sharma's book, Hawaiʻi Is My Haven, Race, Indigeneity in the Black Pacific, is an ethnography based on a decade of fieldwork, including interviews with 60 people of African descent in the islands, including Black Hawaiians, Black Japanese, and African-American transplants from the continental United States. 2 questions frame this project. What does the Pacific offer people of African descent, and how does the racial lens of African Americans illuminate inequalities, including anti-Black racism in the islands? Bringing Black studies into conversation with Native studies that charts how Hawaii's Black residents, including Black Hapas, negotiate race, indigeneity, and culture. The work speaks to studies in critical mixed race studies, or debates rather, in critical mixed race studies, comparative race studies, and Pacific Island studies to analyze Blackness in the Pacific, and offers new theories of belonging that emerge from the intersection of race and indigeneity. Sharma is also the co-editor of Beyond Ethnicity, New Politics of Race in Hawaii, and is working on a project on Black music in the Hawaiian Islands. She's also the co-editor of a special issue of the journal Critical Ethnic Studies on interventions in Pacific Island Studies and Trans-Pacific Studies. She serves on the executive committee and the National Council for the American Studies Association and teaches courses on Black lives, Native studies, Asian settler colonialism, hip hop, Asian Black relations in the US, as well as numerous other topics. So just in terms of the structure of the colloquium, Professor Sharma has really asked us to set up this particular event around a series of questions that are meant to serve as starting points for the book and her research. And so as the colloquium convener, I'll be facilitating those questions. So I think we'll have a sort of, I think, flexible event of sorts where maybe we'll speak or kind of exchange for 45 minutes or so, but also kind of can engage the audience sort of after that, but maybe in between as well. We'll just kind of see how the flow of the conversation goes. So there are 2 ways to ask questions. You can either type your question into the Q&A. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you prefer to type your question, I can read that for you. You can also ask your question directly. This does not require you to type it out. So I'm not the most adept at managing the Zoom webinar interface. So if you would like to ask your question directly, if you could please just alert me to that in the Q&A, and I can unmute you so you can ask your question. So Nitasha, it's really great to have you here today. I'm wondering maybe if we could just start with some reflections on how you got interested in this project.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you everybody who's here. It's super exciting. I'm looking at the participant list, and there's people who are an important part of the book. There's folks who have known me since I was a baby. My mom is here, folks who I've learned from. So thank you so much. And to Nicole and the administrators who helped make this happen. I really appreciate all the work that it takes. I know it's a lot of work, and I feel like I've seen Nicole in front of this screen maybe once a week for the last 3 weeks, because I've been really interested in a lot of the talks that have been happening. So thank you all so much. And thank you for, going along with the the Q&A talk story kind of format. I think it's a little more engaging than you wouldn't want to just hear me speak for 45 minutes. How did I get involved in this project? So the project is, the book is an ethnography of Black life in Hawaii, and it focuses on non-military civilians who either are from Hawaii, born and raised, or at least raised, who I call Black locals, or Black transplants, right? So these are people of African descent who consider themselves to be part of the African diaspora, most of whom move to the islands as adults for work, to leave the places that they came from, or for school. And they tend to be from the continental US, but also from the continent of Africa and the Caribbean, as well as Asia and Europe. So I came to this in a lot of ways. I mean, I had joined grad school thinking I was going to do a project on mixed race studies back in the 1990s. And for some reason, anthropology, which is a discipline I have a vexed relationship with and have since divorced, but whose method I hold on to, it really moved me to a different direction. So my first book was on South Asian American hip hop artists. And there's actually a parallel with this work here, in that I'm always interested in interminority relations. I'm really concerned about interminority antagonisms and racism that we sort of adopt through white supremacy and, impute upon other groups. And so this project also comes from that desire to chart, what are the tensions that we see between island residents and Black residents in Hawaii? What are some of the tensions that emerge among Hawaiians and people of African descent? What accounts for them? But the goal always is really, the full motivation of my work is to really look for models on the ground ethnographically of folks who are really kind of messing things up and creating, troubling kind of our more facile and clean theories, to show us what are those areas of solidarity and alliance building. And I know solidarity is sort of a very big key word that people are either sort of into or who feel, there's others in some fields of Black studies who feel like solidarity is not where it's at. It's about one's own groups and thinking about race-specific liberation. But I'm really interested in cross-minority solidarities. So two main things about how I came to this project. One is it finally brought me home to Hawaii, and I've been long wanting to return home, literally, but also now intellectually. So I got to bring my family home, my growing family home for the last 10 years. And the other part was being in Black studies. I'm, like you said, Nicole, in that very kind introduction, that I'm a professor in African American studies and Asian American studies. And, I've learned a lot about the world and about inequality and theories of race and concepts and desires for liberation through my colleagues in Black studies and the field. And so, whereas my first book did not center Black people, it really talked about how South Asian Americans adopt Black culture. Some of the critique was that, well, it's not really about Black people. And so here I really wanted to focus on members of the African diaspora and to think about what liberation and life and anti-Black racism looks like outside of the Black Atlantic, and to see what the Pacific offers. So again, it's my love for Hawaii and that it brought me home, and my desire to give back, as well as being in Black studies and sort of all of the things that I've learned about race and theories of inequality from that field.
Thanks, Nitasha. I was like that you mentioned some of the connections between your previous book and the research for this book as well. What would you say the central debates are that you're trying to engage in this project? And could you say a bit about the subfields that you're pulling together, for example, debates and conversations that are happening between Black and Native studies?
Yeah, so, anyone who's worked on a project, whether it's a dissertation or an article or a book or a second book, as we all know, it's really challenging pulling fields together. No matter how, focused our area of study is, we're still bringing things together. And so that means trying to give the context, say in this book, give the context for folks who are familiar with African-American history and African-American studies, giving them the context of Hawaii and the dynamics and history of Hawaii. And then trying to tell the story of Black life in Hawaii also means for people who are familiar with the islands to really give the context of what are the dynamics and histories and struggles and resistances that the Black diasporas face, and also bringing into conversation critical mixed race studies, which has been a long interest of mine. So one of the main debates that I'm trying to enter and be in conversation with is this kind of ongoing conversation now for a number of years between Black studies and Native studies. And this tends to be North America focused. And I really wanted to think about Black and Native American studies or Black and Indigenous studies within the context of the Pacific. Because I think that it is underanalyzed in a lot of ways, within the Pacific and specifically in Hawaii, there's particular paradigms that have become so important and have shaped the ways that we do scholarship here in the continent in Black studies and American studies, ethnic studies, including settler colonialism and Asian settler colonialism, notions of aloha aina, of kuleana. These things have really affected the ways that people are doing research in Asian American studies, in continental Black studies here. But I wanted to see what happens when we shift our analytics of Black studies away from the continental US to the Pacific. And I think that we can move away from a particular impasse that has sort of some folks have been saying that Black studies and Native studies has reached an impasse where there are debates that argue that the two are incommensurable. And I'm familiar with this kind of language as someone who is also a scholar in Afro-Asian studies, where there's been resistance to the idea of any kind of comparability or commensurability between Asian Americans and African Americans. It's something that I disagree with. So I do think that if we shift to the Pacific, it really illuminates the importance of multiple notions and embodied people of African descent within the Pacific, which has really been underanalyzed, I think, in studies of Hawaii, as well as studies of the Pacific, where we look at notions of the circulation of Black music, of Black aesthetics, of Black political ideologies like the Black Power movement or the Pacific Panthers, but we haven't really focused on the actual lived experience of Black people, right? And by this, I mean members of the African diaspora, many of whom are African American, who are not in the military. And I think what this adds to Pacific Island studies, but specifically studies of Hawaii, is really this notion that there are Black local people and that there is anti-Black racism that they detail growing up in the islands, racism that comes from their family members who are Asian, Japanese, Korean, from Hawaiian family members who are accepting of what Brandon Ledward calls white Hawaiians, but Black Hawaiians that I spoke with really faced very common patterned experiences of ostracism and denigration. They were all called the N-word by family members, but they didn't know what to do with it. A lot of times they did not have Black community to go to ask. So what I'm trying to say is I think when we shift from, Black and Native studies from the continental US, when we move to sites like the Caribbean or the Pacific, we have a different context where indigeneity is not seen as something that is of the past or demographically insignificant or culturally irrelevant. These are absolutely not the case. And we see, however, where Blackness becomes quite invisible and is often only adopted in symbolic ways through hip hop or reggae without a true understanding and acknowledgement of Black history globally, but also particularly locally. So I didn't fully answer. Again, it's about 8:00 p.m. over here and my kids have been home, but we'll get to it.
No, thank you. I'm actually wondering if you could fill out something you had said previous, which was a kind of incommensurability between Black and Native studies. Could you describe that a little bit more for people who might not be as familiar with those debates and how you think the book intervenes in that incommensurability?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So yes, so that helped me get back on track. So one of the things is this, what this book is trying to do is, as I said, I have a vexed relationship with anthropology. I consider myself a critical race studies scholar, like ethnic studies. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is a lot of the work that is looking at Black and Native relations and politics and futures comes from the humanities. And no diss to the humanities, of course. A lot of it is based on literary studies or speculative fiction or histories. And I really wanted to look at a grounded approach of like, okay, what are people on the ground doing? I don't think we only have to look for fictional or literary or historical examples of living otherwise. People are literally living these complicated lives today. If you think about Black Hawaiians who are raised without Black family members on Hawaiian homestead land in Nanakuli, for example. So they really contribute to the idea that kind of breaks up this notion of incommensurability. The way that some of the debates between Black and Native studies have been shaping up, but also we're moving to a more interesting conversation, I think, is that I think it really stems from Afro-pessimist depiction of the particularity and the exceptionalism of the Black experience and the need for Black liberation to be the primary mode and form of liberation first. And that was not to go hand in hand with Native sovereignty or Native liberation, that the two were incommensurable and one came after the other, which I think is a problematic framing. On the other hand, I think there's been some notions of incommensurability where the kind of facile way to say is that Black people were stolen from their land and Indigenous people's land was stolen. And I think people are really complicating that. When we look at people who are often footnoted, so these are people, you know, when we think about Black indigeneities, but also Black Native people, that's where people are looking past incommensurability. But these are often historical examples of Black Native folks in the Southern United States. And so I think that if we see the words of Black Hawaiians, it's not so much incommensurability. It is a simultaneity, it's intersecting, it does not always speak past one another. And that doesn't mean that it's not fucked up and full of tension and problematic. There's all kinds of problematics with Black folks who are in Hawaii who uphold the military project and the military occupation of Hawaii, even as civilians. And again, for instance, just saying the copious examples of Black youth in Hawaii who grew up in their non-Black mothers' homes that face so much anti-Black racism and in the schools, that a lot of Black transplants who face racism from, Japanese lawyers or Filipino nurses, these are all examples they tend to bring a racial lens, and some go to the courts. And we have, I think, a Black lawyer here on today, and they go to the courts and they really call out this as systemic racism and sometimes fight against this through the courts. I'm moving away from your question about incommensurability, but my point is that when we look ethnographically on the ground, as opposed to speculative notions of what could be otherwise, we do see that these are not incommensurabilities, that sometimes these groups overlap, sometimes they are within the same people and communities, and that Black and Indigenous, histories and contemporary life and political futures are not incommensurable. They're in fact hand in hand. So we cannot have deoccupation or decolonization of Hawaii without anti-racism at the same time.
Thank you so much. That was a very thorough and engaging answer. I have a sort of related question to that, which is sort of the way that Pacific Island studies, Black studies, and critical mixed race studies intersect with one another in the book. So how do you think about those literatures, maybe individually or as intersecting or changing in some way through those conversations? In particular, putting critical mixed race studies into conversation with Black studies. And then a secondary question, which is how you think Black studies contributes to our understanding of Hawaii.
Yeah, so another kind of debate that I wanted to really engage, and remember I said when I went to grad school, I thought I was going to do some project on mixed race studies. And this is back in the 1990s, right? And now there is a small field, critical mixed race studies. And I felt that I wasn't consciously trying to contribute to critical mixed race studies, but I don't think you can really study the people of Hawaii without engaging and coming into contact and telling the stories and hearing the stories of people who consider themselves to belong to more than one racial category or mixed folks. And so within Black studies, I think there's this tension, or within, there has been a tension about the 20 to the 2000 census about allowing people to choose more than one race. And there was a long kind of historical struggle by white mothers of mixed kids for a multiracial box. And then from the multiracial movement, or folks who identify with more than one race, who said, no, we want to check all of the different boxes. There was some pushback from some sectors of the Black community who argued that this is not good because it will lead to smaller numbers of Black folks if you have a multiracial box. And the census is also the basis for federal funding for groups, so that if more people were given the option to not just be Black, because of anti-Black racism that gets internalized, where mixed people want to be, the assumption is anything but Black, that would lead to a problem. So my issue with this is that a lot of, some folks in mixed race, in Black studies, Jared Sexton, Minka Makalani, have argued that multiracialism is a racist project, that Black is a category that is capacious enough to incorporate the folks that I talk to, or to incorporate folks like Colin Kaepernick or Obama, or somebody who's Black and Okinawan or Black Hawaiian, that all of these people only have to be Black, and anything that signifies a person who says, no, what I'm Black and white, as Obama did, or I'm Black and Japanese. Some people presume, especially I'm in Chicago for the last 15 years, some folks believe, no, you're just trying to run away from Blackness. And when we center a place where multiraciality is the norm, people always say normalize this, normalize that. But in Hawaii, right, multiraciality is very common. I think what we see is that when Black folks identify and call up all of their ancestries, or for Black transplants who are asked, what are you? And they think that's so weird because they say, look at me, I'm obviously Black. And then a local person would say, that's not right, you have to say all of your ancestries. So by the end of the 5-10 years that they've been in Hawaii, by the time I talk to them, they're saying, oh, I'm Black and Cherokee, and I have some Scottish Irish. But that's not how they would have responded. And I think what I'm trying to contribute to this presumption in Black studies, which is an understandable suspicion toward multiracialism, is that when one accounts for all of one's ancestries in the context of Hawaii, it is also adopting an indigenous epistemology and practice of expansive genealogical identifications. In a lot of ways, right, Hawaiians and Black folks have similar ways of contending with identity because of racism and because of dispossession, where some Hawaiians, right, of course, know that a lot of folks' ancestries include Haole and include Chinese and include Portuguese, right? But people might identify as Hawaiian. Similarly, for African Americans, I think we know that most African Americans who did not migrate from Africa and the Caribbean recently have, white and Native American ancestors, but they say that they're Black only. So we understand the context of that. So anyway, I'm trying to really bring critical mixed race studies into conversation with Black studies by saying that in Hawaii, the articulation of all of one's ancestors does not flatten out these differences, these critical differences. And also it's not necessarily a running away from Blackness. However, a lot of Black locals really highlighted the term local. They said, I'm Black local, or I'm a Black Okinawan local, or I'm a Black Korean townie. They really felt they had to modify Blackness in a way that does show and highlight some ambivalence toward a Black only identification. So it's both a site of possibility for Black transplants who are like, wow, I can think about all of my genealogies and think about my indigenous ancestry, Native American. But on the other hand, there's also some evidence, right, a lot of evidence that Black locals really feel they have to modify their Blackness with a local belonging, which is often their Asian or Samoan or Hawaiian belonging, because they're seen as not being from here. I feel like I'm speaking forever. I'm so sorry, Nicole.
No, it's fine. I feel like you've maybe touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could sort of distill a bit more how you think the Pacific as a sort of location of research or a place where you're working, right? What does this offer people of African descent, right? How does it speak to or expand Black studies, the Black Atlantic, or studies of the African diaspora?
Yeah, so I think looking at the Pacific is so critical for Black studies, African diaspora studies, African American studies. I mean, I've said that in Pacific Island studies, I think folks do need to account for Blackness in the Pacific, not just historically from concepts of pull, but also contemporarily, all at the same time, moving Black bodies and Black folks who have settled in the Pacific or who are from the Pacific. On the other hand, yeah, I think Black studies can be incredibly enriched by concepts that and experiences and theories and lives in the Pacific. And I lost my train of thought. That is that, you know, folks in Hawaii were coming to the islands as formerly enslaved people in the end of the 18th century, 19th century. And they came to a place where it was not a slave society. And I think what it does is it truly disrupts the African Americocentrism of our notion of the Black experience, but it also reveals what happens to the possibilities of Black life in a place that is not structured along a Black and white binary. One of the fallouts is Black invisibility. And there's like really painful articulations, even from Black professors at UH, who have said that the invisibility that they face, the disrecognition, the lack of recognition of just eyes just rolling right off the person is so painful, as opposed to Black hypervisibility in the continental US. So a lot of it is mixed with pain. But I think what also happens is this idea that it really disrupts the Black and white binary that is so foundational to the way we think about the United States. And other things emerge when we think about a non-slave society in which genealogical and ancestral connections to place is important, and where people who were enslaved when they had gotten onto these ships in Boston and New Bedford ended up in a society in which they came to advise kings, or they were part of the Royal Hawaiian, the band. And so I think that the possibilities there contributes to this idea of an A to B discourse, that folks came from, West Africa to the Caribbean and then to the United States. It kind of disrupts this middle passage hegemony, I would say.
I know we have a number of students in our audience, and I think they'd be interested, or that a number of them are interested in some of these debates that you're engaging, and might, I think, be curious to know how you're framing, your methods question. How did you conduct this research? What research techniques or practices did you use? And also, how did you encounter people and places in your work?
Yeah. I mean, so I'm totally dedicated to the method of ethnography. I think I'm just a very concrete Libra, and I sort of need a there. It's why I'm an atheist. I know it's very hard for me. And so to do more speculative work. So in a lot of ways, it's not visionary at all. It's very concrete, and it's based on people's stories and perspectives and spending a lot of time with them. So, I started doing this work in 2009. And so it's a very long time, but of course I couldn't sustain research for a long time because I live in Chicago. I teach in Chicago, and at first it was me, then me and my partner, then me and one kid, and then another kid. It cost a lot of money to go home. So it was ethnography over time, and it's all the typical parts of ethnography. And I know this is a political science department, but heavy hanging out, going to bars, going to nightclubs, going to the beach, calling up high school friends and telling them, okay, this is my project. Do you know anybody who is Black, who identifies as Black? My father, who since passed away, he was a UH professor. He would, this is a problematic term, but my father would say what he would say. He would, quote unquote, snatch any Black person he could. And so the first person he snatched, quite problematic here, was actually a Black nurse whose my interview with her was the second interview of the whole project in 2009. The first interview was with Miles Jackson, who is a dean at UH. And she was the one who told me about, who said, Hawaiʻi is my haven, and that became the book's title. So friends from high school would remind me, oh, don't you remember so-and-so is Black Hawaiian? Oh, don't you remember so-and-so is not, I think they're, Black Okinawan. I went to a bar once with my husband, maybe midway through, maybe 5 years ago, and we were served drinks. And I asked the bartender, how long have you been here in Hawaii? He was, he read as of African descent, and he had button-down shirt, of course, his name tag. And he said, you know, I'm Black Samoan, I'm from here. And everybody reads me as not being from here, obviously because of the way I look, obviously because of the way I speak. And so even then there, you know, I had to overcome my desire not to talk to anybody, to then have to ask. I racially profiled people, right? I racially profiled people and would ask if I could speak with them. I spent time with people in their homes. I went to a lot of events that were hosted by Popolo Project, a lot of events at UH, and people at UH have been so incredibly important. John Okamura, so many people introduced me to other people. So yeah, and then interviews, formal interviews. I say that I interviewed 60 people of African descent. I actually spoke to hundreds of people. 60 is just a nice number of the formal, you know, interviews that I had. And I often spoke to people, you know, for 2 hours and then hung out with them many, many times, and then would come back, you know, 5 years later and say, okay, now, you know, BLM is happening. Black Lives Matter is happening. We didn't even talk about that 8 years ago when we were under Obama, right? So things had changed a lot. So there's also kind of a longitudinal study, which wasn't my intention. I wish I had finished it years ago, but it unfolded the way that it did. So that's the way it is, you know. And again, I had to force myself to talk to people, and I met people all around, from, you know, driveways in Papakolea to Starbucks, a lot of Starbucks in Manoa and Kaneohe. A lot of students I met from Tai Tengen and Monisha Dasgupta and my mom, they introduced me to students at UH. They're a pretty significant number of folks who are in the book, and I met them at the campus center. A lot of interviews at the campus center over time. So that's how I did it.
I'm wondering how people sort of responded when you approached them. Maybe if you didn't know them about the project, you know, were people very enthusiastic? Were they reserved? You know, maybe I imagine you probably had sort of a, you know, different responses, but I'm wondering what those were like for you.
I think people were, no, I mean, gosh, this, you know, I was so nervous to speak tonight, and I was nervous to speak several weeks ago to UH Ethnic Studies and Sociology. You know, there's just a lot at stake, and I these are people's stories and their lives and their perspectives, and you don't want to fuck it up, you know, especially I'm not a Black person and I'm not Hawaiian. My dad is from India and my mom is white, and I'm from Hawaii. And so I'm very aware of the racial politics and the positionality. I'm very okay with that. I'm in Black studies as a non-Black person, so I'm very familiar with that. But I think that it means that you know, it always means you don't want to fuck up people's narratives and stories. And it can get really tricky. People told me devastating stories. They cried a lot of, you know, a number of women cried because no one had ever asked them, what was it like growing up as a Black Okinawan in Kaimuki? What was it like growing up as a Black Hawaiian woman on the North Shore? And they had really hard stories, right? So I think people were so wonderful. I mean, there were a few times when I would try to contact someone, especially Black women, because of the disproportionate number of Black men in Hawaii, including residents who are not military. There's a disproportionate number historically of Black men, more Black men, because of the systems that bring them, even athletics, but also, of course, the military. And so students had a more equal gender balance, but I would try several times to contact Black locals who wouldn't respond. And so you just have to let that go, right? But generally people were, I would say that Black transplants were very familiar with the kinds of questions I was getting at about this question about racism and what is it like, what is Black, you know, life like in Hawaii? What do you think about the racial dynamics? For my interviews with Black locals, including people I went to high school with or folks I had never met before, it was a little harder because I think our questions, the way that folks talk about difference and community and belonging in Hawaii is not like, do you face anti-Black racism? Or, you know, what is your racial consciousness? I had to ask different questions in a different way. So people were very open, but I think some of the interviews were really hard for people, and it was hard for me. And I learned a lot from Black lawyers, oh my goodness, about the cases that they had put forth and the advocacy of a lot of Black transplants who moved to Hawaii who were professionals. So there's a particular class dynamic that's quite unique from the continental US, where a lot of Black folks who moved to Hawaii because of how expensive it is, they tended to come as adults and they worked in education at UH as teachers. They worked in medicine, and a lot of historical legacy of Black lawyers, which Daphne Barbie Wooten, who's on this call, she wrote a really fantastic book on, and they would advocate for racism that local youth faced, whereas Black locals would not necessarily speak so openly about these things. So people were amazing. The conversations could be hard, and it was always fulfilling. Every time I had to go to an interview, I was like, why am I an ethnographer? I don't want to talk to people. It's so extractive. And every time I finished, it was so amazing.
Oh, that's amazing. You mentioned that you came across, I think in your research, more Black men in Hawaii because of the systems that bring them over, the military, athletics. I hadn't really thought about that, but actually, as you explained it, it does kind of make sense. I'm wondering if there was anything for you that was sort of surprising or kind of unexpected that you had come across in the course of your research.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say something first more about the gender dynamics in politics, if I could, and then I'm going to forget your question. So I'm going to ask you to ask me again. It's also for local Black folks. A lot of the people I interviewed were more men than women, and even them, Black Samoans, Black Okinawans, even the children of 2 Black parents from Hawaii, they would recount how their sisters or their cousins who were Black and had left Hawaii. So even Black locals, who, birth rates, you would think, men and women equal numbers, but a lot of local Black women would leave the islands because of gendered anti-Black racism, where they just, because of beach life, the global denigration of Blackness, the desire for particular standards of beauty of local Japanese, haole mixed women, girls, these kinds of things really affected the social life and the possibilities of family life for a lot of Black women. And so they went to the continental US. And so my conversations with Black women were harder to come by and were more difficult. So it's not just that fur trading and sailors and whaling and the military and athletics are predominantly male, right? And so these are the imperial institutions that brought way more Black men than women. But then Black men from the Cape Verdeans of the early, Cape Verdeans from the 19th century who married Hawaiian women, even, generations of their children. It's been a very different experience for Black women. So I did want to comment on that. There's also different models of being able to embrace one's Black identity that were available for Black men, particularly in line with the Hawaiian Renaissance, where you see this with Black Hawaiian men who would tell me that back then it wasn't good being Black or Hawaiian in the 70s when they were born. And now in the 90s, 2000s, and now with the Hawaiian cultural Renaissance and hip hop and sort of the global notion of the desirability of Black masculinity, they've had models that are not available to Black women in Hawaii. I forgot your other question about something. Oh, what surprised me? Okay. I gave Nicole some of these questions and I haven't thought about what surprised me. What surprised me is that I could finish the damn book finally. Okay. What surprised me is this: every time my family and I went back, every time we saw a Black person, including my Black husband, he would say, or I would say, research. And so what it means is that, and I'm not meaning to objectify, what it means to say is it is truly incredible to see the growing civilian Black population in Hawaii. I've seen it because I've been looking, right, every time. And so I just looked up, before talking with you today, Nicole, I looked up the 2020 census on Hawaii. And so the Black civilian population has increased 20% in the last 10 years. And it's small, but it is really significant, and it's increasing. And it is increased every decade since they've been charting that. And so part of it is the Obama effect, which we can talk about another time. Part of it is that people are really fleeing the systemic violent racism of the continental US and are hearing about Hawaii as a place that historically too provided opportunities of less pressure, which is the title of a chapter. Places they can breathe, which is very important signification on the notion of, in the statement, I can't breathe. very different stories of encounters with police, although we can talk about that too. So these are the kinds of things that surprised me. I mean, I'm not surprised by how much I learned and how indebted I am to the folks that I spoke with.
Nitasha, we have a couple of questions that have come in. I thought maybe we could move to those and then get back to some of the other questions if there's time. Hildra, she's one of our PhD students here in the department. She says, I would like to ask how your work is affected or kind of relates to the fight on here, but also, on the mainland, and also here on, critical, the sort of war on critical race theory in the United States, and, how you think about this, but also how to approach the topic without backlash. I'll let you interpret that as you.
Yeah, I mean, Hilda, thank you for the question. I mean, I'm in a bubble, and I'm in a very happy bubble, meaning that I'm at an elite, well-endowed institution that's a private institution, which means that I have time and money to do this kind of research. And I feel very hypocritical about that, because I do think that capitalism is a system we need to overthrow, along with other systems of settler colonialism, my gosh, racism, patriarchy, right? So we're in contradiction, but within that institution, I was asked if I wanted to be in anthropology and Asian American studies, or if I wanted to be in Black studies or African American studies and Asian American studies. And I chose the latter. And so I chose that. So the kinds of units and the kinds of institutions and the kinds of geographies that we end up in really shape as academics, who are, some of us are in more politicized, explicitly politicized fields than others. Within Black studies and Asian American studies, I have so much free reign to embrace my full progressive self. And I warn students, and I tell them I don't give trigger warnings on my syllabi. All the syllabi are dealing with systems that lead particular populations as, their closeness to death, as Ruthie Gilmore says. And so what I'm saying is that when we are in ethnic studies, it is a space where you can consider, encounter, teach, advocate critical race theory. It's foundational. It's no more or no less important than Black feminist theory, than all kinds of theories, And so, I have been able to have the privilege of curating classes, and my position within the university and the work that I do in places where I don't need to defend anything when it comes to the centrality of certain theories of race. People won't read my stuff if they want to, or maybe people will say negative things outside of that context. So that's what I'm thinking.
Thanks, Nitasha. There's another question from Daphne Barbie Wooten. She says, thanks for the book shout out about African-American lawyers in Hawaii. Thanks for the book and the shout out. What do you think about the DOE and Honolulu police arresting a 10-year-old Black girl in school? This is something that had happened just recently. And I think that there was an article in the Civil Beat I just saw recently where the police department had said, it's too bad that people are making this an issue of race. I'm adding that to the question, but she says, do you agree that this is a continuation of anti-Black racism in Hawaii?
Thank you, Daphne. I'd love to hear when I come home next month, we should hang out. Oh, of course, this is a continuation of anti-Black racism, of the recent murder of Lindani, right? Of the recent murder of SICAP, right? I remember SICAP. I mean, these are legacies of anti-Black racism that the police, no matter what color you are as a police officer, diversifying a police force does not make it an agent of state violence. And so just because I understand, so I am totally an abolitionist with regard to the police and prisons. And I think that's very easy to, a stance that's very easy to maintain in a city like Chicago, where systemic police murder of Black people, children, babies, daily is part of the landscape that we're in, and it is normalized. So when I'm here in Chicago and I read, about SICAP, I remember SICAP, and about Lindani, and about the Asian folks who called the cops on him, right? And then about this girl, I absolutely read about this girl. The mother was there while the girl was taken to jail. I mean, she was handcuffed and they didn't tell the mother. Of course, it is a legacy of anti-Black racism that is systemic. And this is where Hawaii is not a break or exceptional from the continental US. It has these systems of domination that are continuations of systems within the United States. And the police are, from the legacy of slave catchers and of the KKK. And it doesn't mean that individual police officers who are often family members in Hawaii, it doesn't mean their ancestors were in the KKK, but it means that they're participating in a similar system that regulates life and death for people. And yes, there is deep endemic anti-Black racism in Hawaii, and it also transfers onto Micronesians. And when people say that Micronesians are Black people of the Pacific, I think that's a really critical comparative call. But it's also important to remember that there are Black people in the Pacific also, right? Members of African descent. So yeah, I think, of course, Daphne, you still have so much work to do, right? We all have so much more work to do about these really dispiriting and continuities of anti-Black racism at work, but with the police, at school, and within families. Yeah.
Thanks for that question, Hildra and Daphne. Also, I just want to encourage the people who are with us to please either post questions or just make a note in the Q&A that you'd like me to unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. This, I think, perhaps might be a good time to transition to maybe a discussion about how something like Black Lives Matter interfaces or intersects with the Hawaiian sovereignty movement here in Hawaii.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because in most renditions of the intro that I wrote up until the very last minute, the book started out by talking about Martin Luther King Jr. and how he had lay as he was crossing a bridge during a march. And then it talked about W.E.B. Du Bois, who had a layover in Hawaii in the early 1900s. And it featured like all these voices of these historical Black male figures and Obama. And then I realized, what am I doing? Like, this has to be very contemporary. And like, the people who are doing the work right now of really documenting Black life in the Pacific, like the Popolo Project, and folks who are really trying to bring questions of Hawaiian sovereignty hand in hand with Black Lives Matter. A lot of these folks are Black women in Hawaii who are from Hawaii or who moved to the islands and who really are reflective of their positionality, not as part of the military, but in their relation to this place that they are not from, and particularly in relation to Native Hawaiians or Kanaka Maoli. And so, but the hard part is that when you are doing ethnography, it gets very messy. And so, folks have really shown how, unfortunately, I think there's been some tendency, not all, of course, to see the movement on Mauna Kea and the Kia'i as being in contestation, or to see Black Lives Matter protests in Hawaii as drawing away from Hawaiian sovereignty and also the movement to stop the TMT on Mauna Kea. And so there's this idea, or these very real experiences where folks who were participating in Black Lives Matter protests several years ago, actually, this is not a recent phenomenon, who one Black protester had a bottle of water thrown at their face, and they, and people said, keep that shit out of here. Keep that shit away from here. That's not about what's happening here. That stuff belongs on the mainland, right? And this person felt so, and they're from Hawaii, right? And so there's also this idea that Black Lives Matter does not belong in the islands because it's not a place of anti-Black racism. In fact, it's not a place of Blackness at all. And that all sorts of actions might detract from the protectors. And so what I hope to end on, right, is the idea that Huli had created a statement that had really acknowledged, and Patrice Kahn-Cullors, who was one of the people who co-founded Black Lives Matter, she came to Hawaii several times. And in both Huli's statement and also Patrisse Cullors' statement, they recognized Hawaiians of African descent, right? They were looking at people who were mixed. They also were recognizing anti-Blackness in Hawaii and that needed to be addressed. And so I think that ultimately, as I'm saying, it's messy on the ground where folks see anti-Black racism as not a thing that is part of Hawaii. And yet, if you listen to the stories and narratives and experiences of Black people, it is structured within the dynamics of Hawaii. But at the end, I think we see that systems of white supremacy and militarism and patriarchy link, right, decolonization with demilitarization with anti-racism. So I'm hoping that we don't see these as contesting.
I do eventually want to talk about militarism and militarization on the island. Hildra did have another question. Hildra, I'm going to unmute you. Maybe you could ask that in person and sort of elaborate on what you posted in the Q&A.
Okay. Hi.
Hi, Hildra.
Hi, we can hear you.
How are you?
Okay.
I just wanted to ask you, how do you see and how do you analyze the issue of people of African descent attacking people of African descent from a different background or different like states, different countries?
So thanks for the question. I mean, I feel that when this question of what about Black on Black violence emerges, it's often a detraction. It's a detraction from what is really the primary issue, which is white supremacist violence and systems of domination that create on the ground conditions. So if I'm talking about, people like to say, oh, what about Black on Black crime in Chicago, where I am? Oh, why does it all happen on the South Side? It happens because not on Black crime. It happens because of the systemic divestment from these communities. From the fact that 50 schools that closed down, most of them were on the South and Southwest sides where Black and Latino folks go. It happens because the economic opportunities for Black folks, along with heightened policing, is affecting Black communities. So Black on Black crime, this question to me is always kind of a detraction. And the answer is that it systemically produces systems of struggle for survival that I think a lot of other communities understand too. So, we don't say, I don't think the appropriate question is this one or the one that says, what about Hawaiian on Hawaiian violence? These are structured, right? And that these communities have been sort of disenfranchised through these systems. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hildra. I'm wondering, Nitasha, if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between racing, policing, and abolition on the islands. And I'm also wondering, just sort of as an addition to that question, if in your interviews, there were any sort of vernacular conversations or vernacular exchanges about abolition. Maybe people were not using that language, but maybe some of the sentiments were there around that. So maybe two different questions there. Please feel free to read.
Police abolition didn't come up very much in our conversations. I mean, folks did talk about questions of sovereignty and what that would look like to participate in working with Hawaiians toward whatever forms of sovereignty, food sovereignty, demilitarization would happen. We didn't talk a lot about abolition. A lot of the conversation was about the trauma of Trump over the last, again, this is a 10-year project, right? And so in a lot of these cases happened more recently when the book was completed, but we did talk, in a chapter on racism that documents anti-Black racism, there's a section on policing, and it was actually a lot of local Black women who had some of the most terrible experiences with local police, right? And that they felt that they were profiled because of their gender or being non-gender conforming, because they were driving cars that were not fancy, or they were seen as being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they had violent encounters with local police, right? For folks who were transplants, they didn't talk about abolition because they were saying, whoa, the police here are so much cooler than they are. They are not as vexing. It's not as vexed an experience. It's not the sense that you always are in tension because you might be stopped by the police. And that's the comment by Black men from the continental US, that this is a site of less pressure, that you didn't have to constantly watch your back. And I think that's a real important thing when we think about Black life in the Pacific. But the conversation about abolition was not one that emerged a lot. I think it was really about questions to other communities. I see Kathy's question too.
Nitasha, did you want to answer Kathy's question?
Yeah,
I think
sure.
you can see it there. Yes, it was about excluding Black folks who came to Hawaii via the military. And do you think you would have gotten different insights had you included them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I definitely purposefully did not want to talk to people who are stationed in the military. There was one exception I made. He was in the military, but was no longer for decades, actually. I purposefully was looking at people of African descent who identified as members of the African diaspora who were not in the military in order to contest the hegemony, the hegemonic association, not to contest, to expand the hegemonic association that Black is military. And I think the issue is that we don't see Black localness at all, or Black civilians, right? And so this is really endemic to the way that Black locals feel that they don't belong here, and that they have to have a very ambivalent or downplay their relationship to Blackness by highlighting other aspects of local identity, or their Samoan background, or their Okinawan background, because of the sentiment that is tied to anti-Blackness, which is that Black folks are only in Hawaii as part of the military. And so what happens, I think, is that Black visitors come. Like, I know that we had the American Studies Association conference in Hawaii, and Honani K. Trask had won and was greeted with this award that was presented by Angela Davis. Some of the graduate students in my Black Studies PhD program here said, oh my gosh, anti-Black racism is so strong in Hawaii. And it is, and yet I think what it is a conflation of is that folks are conflating any anti-Black and white sentiment as anti-Black racism, when in fact, to me, it's also part of a local anti-military or anti-colonial critique, right? But the problem is that Black folks, no matter if they're civilians or not, are perceived as being part of the military. Essentially, Kathy, I'm going on and on. I wanted to give voice to Black locals because we only think they're part of the military. Most of the studies of the Black Pacific have been based on the military. I absolutely think I would have gotten different insights and a different narrative if I spoke to Black folks in the military. But I think that segment of the population gets so much attention, not to say that it's adequately complex enough, but absolutely Black civilians their stories have not been told, and their vexed relationships to the military. Both, imagine being Black and Okinawan and Black Hawaiian, these men who said that they wear their hair in certain ways and speak pidgin in certain ways, and perform localness because they are mistaken for being in the military, when some of them are themselves critical of the military and want to say, no, my parents met here, I'm from here. So this constant evacuation of Blackness from Hawaii outside of a military context is really what I wanted to highlight in these stories. So thank you for that question, Kathy.
Nitasha, you also talk about, or you use the term local, and you had mentioned, I think maybe in the book, but also in your question to me, that local has been a term that's been critiqued by other scholars. So I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on what that critique looks like, and also why you use local as a category in the book and what it means for you and for this project.
Yeah, I mean, I just was talking about Black PhD students in the Black Studies department that I'm in. And a lot of the tendency I see across the academy right now is, quote unquote, high theorizing. It's a lot of abstraction. And I think this is important and innovative, but again, I said how concrete I am. Sometimes if there's not enough there, I'm not gonna buy the theory. This is not like an antagonistic approach to questions of localness, but what I'm saying is, I'm an ethnographer, it's very concrete. I talk to a lot of people. And so the categories that emerge that shape the chapters and then the arguments emerge from what I found, right? Both what people say, but then when you spend 10 years with people, it's also how they live and what they do. And localness emerged as such a critical category, both for distinguishing like both by local Black folks to say, I'm local, I'm from here, I'm not in the military, I'm not a tourist, right? It was so important to them, whereas they had a more vexed, ambivalent relationship toward Black local, right? They had to really, and I think a lot of that is because there's not a Black metropolis in Hawaii. They didn't have a lot of access to information about African-American history. Do we even teach in K through 12 about Black history into the Hawaiian Islands? So there's a total sense of being evacuated and not belonging and only being seen as, oh, you must be the kid of a military member. And so, oh my gosh, what was I talking about? Oh, so localness. So localness becomes really critical for Black locals. That's how they identified without a doubt, without ambivalence, unequivocally. It was also, localness was also super key, and it emerged in all the conversations I had with Black transplants who were African descended people, many of whom were also mixed, who moved to Hawaii, whether from, where did it come from? Whether from, oh my goodness. Sorry, whether from the continental US or if they came from the Caribbean, right? Or if they came from, I'm trying to think exactly where he comes from. So what happens is they also, see, I wrote it 10 years ago, right? They would also really bring up this term, I'm not local. And there was a really strong significance to that because there was an ambivalence about being local. Folks have argued, including people who left the islands, Black folks who left the islands, who said, Hawaii is a great place if you're Black, if you're willing to give up your racial consciousness and all of those things that provide you with a firm sense of Black identity. In order to be comfortable here and at peace, you have to give that up and embrace a local cultural, local cultural practices and a local identity. And it necessitated giving up a Black consciousness and the desire for Black foods or Black community. And I think that some folks would disagree with this, especially an older generation of post-civil rights folks who have cultivated Black community in Hawaii. But Black transplants really talked about this term of not being local and how that was really, relevant for them. Asian settler colonialism really highlights, right, how the term local is used by Asian settlers to obfuscate our role in Native Hawaiian dispossession. The thing is that I think when we look through the analytics of race, and this is ultimately what I'm hoping the book intellectually says, is when we think about indigeneity and race, when we look at Hawaii through the analytics of race and not just the native settler binary, the notion of settler becomes ruptured because Black folks are not, as a group, either settlers or not settlers. It depends. If you're part of the military, you are part of the occupation of Hawaii and the dispossession of Hawaiians. The Secretary of Defense is the first Black Secretary of Defense, which people celebrate, but this is truly problematic. And to say he has no agency is problematic. And so on the other hand, Black folks who are from Hawaii, who are moved to Hawaii, who do land restoration or who are working with Micronesian social services, I cannot call them settlers. And so to me, when you bring in an analytics of race, localness really emerges as a key distinction about belonging, time of belonging, and as one Black man from Miami said, Hawaii really knows how to spit people out. And a lot of that is a willingness to give up one's Black racial consciousness to wholeheartedly be accepted as local. And it's harder for people who are identifiably Black than for folks who were multiracial, who looked not necessarily identifiably Black. So yeah, the category emerges from that. And I think it unsettles these binaries of Black and white, but also native settler. And localness to me cannot just be thrown out as a problematic, only as a mode of critique of how we are trying to obfuscate our role in settler colonialism for people who are not Hawaiian. I think it's a true category that maintains important resonance for folks.
Daphne says, good observation. Hannah, would you be all right if I unmuted you so that you can ask your question? I'll allow you to talk in my Zoom box, and if I hear you, I'll assume it's okay. If I don't, I'll read it.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Professor Sharma, and hello from a fellow Chicagoan. I'm always really excited when I get to talk to people who live from, back home. I am particularly interested in questions of religion and religious identity and how they can kind of be used not only to form and cement identity, but as a form of empowerment and resistance. And so in terms of Black spirituality, I think of hoodoo, which merges a lot of folk traditions, but is very much grounded in the knowledge of coming across the Middle Passage, or something like voodoo, where sacred power can be found on Barlo, beneath the water, talking about the ancestors that were lost in the Middle Passage. So I was wondering if you could potentially give insight on Black spirituality here in Hawaii and what that looks like. If it's very much a melange of a kind of African influenced spirituality with Polynesian roots, or kind of what form it takes if that potentially came up in your studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That's such an important question, and it's one I don't have an answer to, and that's my limitation because I didn't talk to people about religion, right? And so that is my bad, right? And I think that's part of it emerges because of my privileging of an analytics of race, right, and place and connection to Kanaka Maoli. So I can't answer that, but what I would say is I think that there are a variety of ways that the Black folks I spoke to celebrate a practice and practice religion. Part of it is, is a very Christian dominant kind of expression of things. And Black churches have been very important, along with military bases, in terms of where some communities of African-American middle-class professionals have come together. The Black church, or some Black churches, or churches attended by numbers of Black long-term residents, has been a really key site of Black community formation. But there isn't one Black community in Hawaii. And I kind of note some tensions among various Black communities. In fact, I would say, so if Christianity is very foundational to some forms of Black community formation for long-term residents, many of whom are middle class and sort of part of important Black organizations like the Links, I would say for that a number of more recent and a different generation of Black transplants to Hawaii, a lot of women who might be queer or they come as single mothers, who are progressive and really trying to create consciously Black and pro-woman and genderqueer spaces. I think their approach to religion is more, I'm going to use all the wrong words. It's not Christian and it's not of dominant religions. And it is more, it seems to be like a syncretism of local and Hawaiian, practices along with other religious practices from across the diaspora. So for instance, the Popolo Project had put on an event commemorating something during the BLM movements, and people had come and they asked everybody to wear white and to bring an offering, the kinds of, and an attachment to water. And so the kinds of practices I think are much more syncretic or like bringing together and not like so hegemonically or dominantly Christian. I think I'm making some stuff up at this point, so I'm going to stop, but it's definitely, I don't think we're supposed to say blind spot, but it's definitely an area that I didn't analyze adequately.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Hannah. Nitasha, did the Black people that you spoke with talk about sovereignty? And how do you think that they considered their positionality vis-a-vis this place and the question of sovereignty?
I think that was generational too. Like I found that a lot of people who were really tied to the Black Lives Matter movement and who were maybe 10 years younger than me to my age, like, in their 30s and 40s, I think they were much more attuned to thinking about themselves as settlers or as people who were not from Hawaii. And I think they were really taken by how Hawaiians could could mark their ancestors belonging to particular geographies, to particular spaces, and having that sense that they could not do that, right? Because they were African American and they could not chart their generational genealogy back to West Africa. They didn't know where that was. And so some had them reflecting about what that means, that some people can have this transfer generational knowledge. And so it highlighted the rupture for folks from the Middle Passage. But this younger generation of politically progressive, mostly women, but also including like Black Hawaiian men who were involved in fish pond restoration, they were absolutely thinking about how to work collaboratively with, particularly with Native Hawaiians. Asians, it was not that relevant for. I would say, however, for UH students, especially undergraduates, their social worlds were not about Hawaiians or about Polynesians or the Pacific. It was much more their attention to Asia, Asian studies, and also the students that they were around, which was a lot of Asian, local Asian and other students. So they were less aware of questions of sovereignty. I did talk about sovereignty, especially in the last few years, so I would bring it up. So like Hannah's question, I didn't bring up religion, but I did ask, what do you think about these movements, right? And what do you think about food sovereignty? What do you think about what's happening on Mauna Kea? And so, of course, that opens up an opportunity. So for Black Hawaiians, they spoke, they were, obviously had thought about these questions about Hawaiian sovereignty, especially for those who still lived or were from Hawaiian homelands. For other folks, they really reflected, some Black elders really reflected on their Native American, the challenges and resistances of their Native American ancestors that they were connected to in places like Georgia, where they had come, and the kinds of fights that they had with the US government for recognition and for those kinds of things. So they made those kinds of connections and understood also that Native Hawaiians had been disenfranchised and fucked over by the government, just like Black people had been. And so, but that said, there were a lot of different responses to sovereignty. Some folks said, yes, whatever leaders in the Kanaka movement decide to do, we understand what our place is, and it is to follow that. For other folks, they said, listen, I came here and I have my house and this is America, and I don't know, sovereignty is never going to happen. A lot of folks were saying it was not, they would say, as a realist, we know that the government is not going to give back land. So there was basically a plethora of ideas. And one last idea that I'll end on for this question, and if anyone wants to speak or have, say their questions out loud, that's good too, is that Kamaka Kehao Fernandez, who's on the cover of the book, he is he was adopted as a Black baby from the US South into a Hawaiian family on Maui. And he is a Hawaiian falsetto singer. He is very clearly African descended. And he was raised in a Hawaiian family. And as I said, he's an Nahoko award-winning Hawaiian singer. And he talks about, he really blows up our ideas about ancestry and race and culture and indigeneity, right? I mean, it's very generative, even if it's an exceptional story. And what he really talks about very much dovetails with, of course, Hawaiian, some of the Hawaiian notions that we understand in terms of that the land gives you your identity, right? And I think he is not saying, I am Native Hawaiian, but he is trying to recognize what his place is vis-a-vis this land that gave him his identity and his gifts, and that he gives back to. So I don't even know what we were talking about, Nicole. Does anyone want to say anything? I'm happy to speak to boxes of voices.
Yes, sometimes the brief silence can be inspiring. Maybe I should just allow the brave folks in the audience to come forward with their reflections or thoughts, comments.
And I do just want to acknowledge, I think we're all been on Zoom for however many years. It's so weird to talk on Zoom when you can't see. I mean, I'm not telling you that I need to see you, but it's such a strange way. I just feel like I'm talking narcissistically to myself for hours. So I do want to give you all a break.
It's hard. I definitely empathize.
It's very
We
sad.
did have a hand and then it quickly got taken down. I don't know what happened there, but maybe I'll just go back to your earlier comment about UH. You mentioned UH a number of times in this book. I'm wondering what the role of UH is here. What role does it play in this project? And also, why do you find it an important nexus for the different topics and concerns you're outlining?
Yeah, I mean, I think UH is really key. First, it's like the site of so many folks that I talk to. So the university system and education brings a lot of Black people to Hawaii. And not just for athletics, but including athletics. I spoke to football players and basketball players, as well as students who were in Asian studies and ethnic studies, as well as professors who were in different fields, right? So it's a really critical place that draws Black folks to Hawaii in a greater gender balance. The other thing is that the university, has also been the site where sometimes there's one professor who's hired to teach African-American studies or the Black experience in Hawaii, right, in ethnic studies. And a lot of times that position, people have not gotten tenure, or other people in that position have decided to leave. And now there's somebody who's my former student, Ethan Caldwell, who's there, but there's like one, and I'm speaking to you from a Black Studies department here where we grant PhDs. So I think it's the kuleana of the University of Hawaii to expand the number of Black faculty that they have across disciplines, and to really teach, like to be the nodal point of teaching the Black, even K through 12, like to develop with Hawaiian immersion schools and all K through 12. We have to learn African-American history. Like I went to school in Hawaii and I don't remember any of it. I don't remember if we were ever taught that. And I think that the effects of that absence are so strong on the actual psyches and experiences of Black people in Hawaii and for all people. So like the Martin Luther King Jr. Parade happened because folks had to say, this isn't just for Black people, this is for all of Hawaii's residents. So I think UH really has to play a strong role in developing a bigger curriculum that talks about African diasporic history, African-American history, and the long-term presence of Black folks in Hawaii for almost 250 years and the roles that they played. I think that's super critical. Hawaii is not just a Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Hawaiian holy place. There are Black folks who live there, not just in the military. So the other thing I'll say is that I think the Ethnic Studies Department has been really key in thinking about Blackness in the Pacific, and has taken part in a lot of the kind of BLM movements and the movements showing allyship with Black social movements. That's really key. And then of course, longer histories of genealogies between Black studies and folks like Haunani K. Trask, who studied Fanon and Malcolm X, and then comes to Hawaii and teaches a whole generations of students in Hawaii about Black radical thinkers. And that's where, again, it is not an incommensurability, thinking about Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty. These are things that have to go hand in hand.
I'm just, I'll just add that we have had issues on campus over the last 3 or so years with the rise in sort of far right kind of activism movements here, not just at the university, but yes, at the university, but, elsewhere on the islands as well. And so I'm wondering if you had encountered any kind of intersection with this in your research, or, maybe I know the book was probably done months ago, but maybe sort of after the book, if you could speak to that at all, how your work might say something about the way that we're having to deal with these movements and how they're developing here.
I think it's really hard to understand these movements without strong training in racial analysis. And I do think that I hope, and I'm not saying that UH does not offer courses and experts who study race, but comparatively not that much. It's not a predominant paradigm in Hawaii. And again, K through 12, also with common local discourse, we don't talk about race in Hawaii, which is why my interviews with local folks, including non-Black locals, the questions about race were tough because they were like, I don't know what race is. Like, I know my, people ask in Hawaii, yeah, what nationality you? They mean like, what is your racial background, right? But so we don't even use the word race. And then a lot of times local humor is used to be like, oh, they say it's like racist. They got a chip on their shoulder. Take that to the mainland. It's just local humor. And even, oh my gosh, the mayor of, Mayor Kim, he had said when he called this Black man from, who was there as a professional from FEMA on the Big Island, he said, quote, that colored guy in the back. And there was this huge uproar. You cannot call Black people that. And then he said, oh, people just don't understand. They just don't understand local humor. Like, this is just how we do it. And so this is a serious problem, right? We can't just call everything sort of local ethnic humor. And I think we don't have an analytics of the specificities of anti-Black racism. The other thing also, I think UH really, you know, K through 12, Hawaii really needs to understand and promote and teach theories of race alongside theories of indigeneity, alongside this idea about multiculturalism and ethnicity and, you know, ethnic multiculturalism, which can be really problematic. The last thing I'll say about that too is that it's not just Black folks who are facing or being within these systems of race. Like, we all are. The point of it was that I thought that Black folks shining a spotlight on the Black experience in Hawaii especially highlights that Hawaii is a racially structured society. Not only, it's also structured by class and other things. But then if we look, we know then that Micronesians are also racialized in a particular way. We know that Hawaiians are indigenous folks, but they're also historically racialized. And so it's not to pull away from the specificity of indigeneity, but Hawaii is a racially structured society. And when we look at Black folks who are highly racialized, we know, right, from concepts of Blackness and the historical formation of a Black and white binary in the US and the exportation of anti-Black racism, it sheds a special light on how race is a key operating factor. And then I think in Hawaii, we got to teach how different groups are racialized, meaning hierarchically positioned and imputed with certain ideas that then justify economic, political, social inequalities. This is something ethnicity doesn't get to, you know.
We have quite a few questions left, but actually we only have maybe 5 minutes. So I thought I'd just turn it over to you, Nitasha. If there's anything we didn't cover, if there's anything you'd like to share about the book that we didn't have a chance to talk about, I mean, we'd love to hear from you about that.
I started by saying that I was really nervous about tonight, and I don't think I'll ever stop being nervous. I think that's okay though, but it is very fatiguing. I have so much gratitude for, look, I'm about to get like all emotional. A lot of gratitude to people who share their stories, but also to like the scholars that are there, like at UH, oh my goodness. And you know, I'm so far from home. So when I think it was Hannah who said hi to a fellow Chicagoan, Hannah, I was like, I am not a Chicagoan. It always looks foreign here. I live on a little street where when my son was like 3 years old, we went up a garage. We went into a garage, Hannah, and my son thought it was a mountain. That's how flat it is here. What am I saying? So I'm saying that I've been in Chicago a long time, but I have learned so much and taken so much insight from the scholars, including in your department, you know, and I cite them, and it's so important. And you just never know if you can if you're handling it correctly or well. And I think doing work on Hawaii when I'm so far removed from there and so positioned within Black studies and Asian American studies, sometimes the conversation, you don't know if it translates. And if you do, and then when you're in Hawaii, how to translate the local context to a general ethnic studies audience. So that kind of like split living is kind of always a challenge, but I do want to say so many thanks to the scholarship that comes from folks at UH. I have learned a lot. You're in my citations.
Thank you. I do see 2 more questions pop up, and I especially encouraged by students, and one of them, Sarah Brandenstein, is asking a question. So I want to make sure to acknowledge that. Thank you, Sarah. And also there's a question from Ruth. So Sarah says, aloha, I'm wondering if you mostly spoke to people on Oahu, or were there other people you interviewed on the other islands who attended UH Hilo or other UH campuses? And also, could you please speak to any differences you found between the experiences of people living on different islands, in different communities?
Yeah, I'll answer fast because I want to get to Auntie Ruth as well. I'm not sure I ever called you that, Auntie Ruth. So Sarah, I primarily spoke to people on Oahu, mostly in Honolulu, although across Oahu. And so it definitely has that bias, but Honolulu also has a majority of the population, and most of the Black folks who live in the islands live in Honolulu. I did Skype interviews, this was before Zoom, with folks who were on outer islands, including, I don't know if you call them outer islands, including, for instance, somebody on the Big Island who has been pursuing a discrimination lawsuit for a very, very long time. And I just feel like this person has been he reaches out every now and then, and it is heartbreaking because it feels like he has no community and nobody understands his situation. He's fighting and fighting and fighting, and there's no support for that. So it wasn't that I spoke to people on other campuses, but I spoke to any Black folks I could find, and many of them were not affiliated with institutions of learning, of higher learning, right? They were just people who moved in the 80s and they became like entrepreneurs or performers or what have you. So I did speak to people on outer islands, but not many. So it definitely has a Hawaii, Oahu, Honolulu bias to that. Thank you. And then Ruth, can I pick up again on my reference to what Obama means to your analysis? I mean, it was really tricky because this is not a trade book, but one way you can get lots of more general readers is to make this a story about Obama. My point is that it's not about Obama. And in fact, he's not that exceptional, right? His story allowed us to shed light on the Black experience in Hawaii because the quote unquote most famous Black man in the world at one point came from Hawaii. And he was from Hawaii. He was not part of the military, although he went on to rule the military, right? And so I do weave parts of his own narrative throughout the book, but parts that don't get picked up often, such as when he was at Punahou and the teacher invited his Kenyan father to come and talk about what it meant to be Kenyan. He comments on how embarrassed he was, how deeply embarrassed he was. And this is part of the idea of the denigration of Blackness, of not wanting to be affiliated. He didn't want to be affiliated with the only other Black student in the class. He wanted to disassociate. This is a story that a lot of Black locals tell me as well. And also his sort of multiracialism and the fact that his father was not around. He did not have Black community. He was raised by his Haole grandparents, is very parallel to the folks that I talked to. I didn't just talk to folks who were not military. I explicitly talked to people who were not part white. There's one exception. So that means that I spoke to a lot of Black locals, the vast majority of whom were mixed, and they were not white and Black. They were, as I said, Korean Black, Okinawan Black. So Obama, I'm trying to say he sheds light on Hawaii. And I think that he does talk about the optimism that it allowed him. And a lot of the folks that I spoke to would draw on Obama to say, not how proud they were, how they could transfer their notions and understandings and pride in their own Blackness to their kids. But they identified with Obama not as a Black person from Hawaii, but as a local boy. And that's how they identified with him. Whereas a lot of Black transplants said, I came to Hawaii because of Obama, right? The Obama effect. So it's very interesting in that term. Thank you for that. Oh, you're muted, but not so much as last time.
Last time it was like everything I said, I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much for joining us. It was so wonderful to get to talk to you and hear about this project. And I know that our department really appreciated you being with us and sort of sharing your wisdom and your insights and about this research. So thank you for coming, and thanks for being here. And thank you to everybody who came to the talk, and especially those of you who asked questions. It was great to hear your perspectives and thoughts about it as well. And the talk is being recorded, so it'll be available online soon. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. And to all, people are here, but they're not here. It's all very strange. Thank you folks so much, so much. Thank you, Nicole. I am now less nervous. Bye, folks.
Bye.